Chapter 23. Irene Stevens nibbled at her sautéed crab cake. It was nestled in a mild golden curry sauce and garnished with micro-basil, and gazed at Bruce Lucent, who was sitting at the head of the 42-seat table with his wife, that positively ancient Callie Archer with her glossy raven hair. That had to be Miss Clairol, or Irene wasn't the reigning Georgia Peach Princess for 2003. And her gravity-defying 38 double D boobs. Bruce, who had the studliest body ever, but a face like a turnip, round and a little purple around the bottom where his skin was still recovering from the laser peel to get rid of those nasty acne scars, was in the midst of a long, boring presentation about his newest software package, Loose Lips, an interactive speech recognition program that could do everything from read your morning newspaper to you to book your lunch reservation. At this point in the long presentation, too long as far as Irene was concerned, Chef Joel himself clapped his hand to his mouth in amazement. "You mean a computer reserved my special cellar room for this function?" the handsome and dashing chef gasped, smiling broadly, and everyone sat down their salad forks and applauded with appropriate little oohs and ahs and titters of appreciation. It was enough to make a girl gag. "How's the crab cake?" Rory Edwards asked. Rory Edwards, 60, but he didn't look a day over 40, not with that absolute hard body, was Irene's best, and at the moment only, friend in the whole sunny state of Georgia. She just didn't understand why other girls didn't like her. All the men she met did. In answer, Irene popped a bit of the crab cake into her mouth and gave a little shivering moan of ecstasy. That little shiver made her ample bosom quiver on an even larger scale, causing the computer geek across from her to nearly poke himself in the cheek with his fork. Now there was a man who could stand some buzzing with a laser. That unibrow simply had to go, and that tattoo, Unix rules.
"Gentlemen, I've taken advantage of a security flaw in the concession stand mainframe and BitTorrented us some sugar daddies and hot dogs."
Was just too icky for words. Especially on his neck. Imagine having to look at that every single day of your life. "It's delish," Irene simpered. "Thanks so much for bringing me." Roar! Rory Edwards' tanned cheeks turned pink in response to her use of her pet name for him. Roar! And he took off his spectacles and polished them feverishly.
"Damn dirty glasses."
Something he always did, Irene noted archly, whenever she paid him a compliment. He looked pretty darn good for 60, thought Irene. She'd always thought golf was an even bigger bore than computers. But Rory Edwards was living proof positive the sport had something going for it. Either that or Rory was sinking his considerable fortune into liposuction and facelifts. Bruce Lucent aimed the laser pointer he was holding at the giant screen and said, "Next slide, please," in his slightly boyish, but not in a bad kind of way, voice. But instead of the silver and black Lucent banner, an error screen popped up. At the same time, a woman's sultry voice issued from the speakers. "Oh, Bruce, darling, I'm afraid something's gone terribly wrong." The raven-haired beauty sitting beside Bruce made a wide-eyed moo of astonishment and shook her magnificent mane of raven hair. "Why, Bruce, darling," she cried, smiling widely, her teeth like snowy chickens, and her lips like glossy red satin pillows, and pointed to the computer to make sure even the dumbest of the dumb got the joke. "That's my voice." Irene stifled the urge to roll her eyes and stick her finger down her throat and pantomime a person throwing up. Oh, as if, she thought, could any of this be any more fake? Bruce cleared his throat and frowned in mock displeasure. He tripped his head on one side, stroking his rugged chin with his long fingers that looked as if they really knew how to pleasure. A woman, Irene thought dreamily. She squirmed a little in her chair, entertaining racy fantasies about what she'd like to do with a studly body like Bruce Lucent's. Bruce opened his voice to give a command, but before Bruce could speak, the computer voice that was exactly the same as Callie Lucent's voice asked in a husky drawl that sounded like she'd been positively gargling straight tequila, What can I do to make it up to you? It sounded, Irene thought, with uncharacteristic lack of charity, as if Callie Lucent's computer voice was asking if Bruce wanted a blowjob. Stabbing ferociously at her crab cake, Irene pretended for a moment that the golden-sauced crustacean cake was Callie's face. Her oh-so-perfect Baptist face, clear of wrinkles, clear of unsightly hairs, clear of pimples, the arrogant woman. Irene's hand crept to her skin to surreptitiously fondle the hard red zit that was swelling under her creamy skin. It was the kind of zit that hovered under the surface for days, not really showing, but feeling if you touched it, which Irene did about a zillion times a day to see whether it was forming a head or not. Sometimes Irene hated being a mere 22, even if it did mean she could go braless without worrying she'd look like she was carrying 2 droopy water balloons under her trendy Donna Karan tank top. She had firm, upright breasts, the left just a teensy tiny bigger than the first. Something her doctor told her not to worry about. It just made them more kissable, he'd assured her, as he
Pleasure!
her atop the examining table, her feet in the stirrups, his hand over her mouth to stop her unstoppable little cries of ecstasy. Irene's nostrils flared with delicate disdain as she glared at Callie Archer's ample bosom. There was more silicone floating in that woman's chest than there was in the laptop computer Bruce Lucent was showing off this very minute to the 2 men at the table. Irene wondered momentarily who they were, and if they were as well-to-do as Bruce. One of them, Irene could tell she was a computer geek from the fact he was wearing a Star Trek t-shirt under his sports jacket, a jacket so old and tatty it had shiny elbows and blue jeans from Gap. There was even a plastic strip running down the leg that said 38, 38, 38, 38 all the way down to his calf. Was engrossed in whatever was on the screen. The other, a young red-headed man with ginger freckles and a studly body but a really ugly face, and the worst teeth Irene had ever seen on a man, was ogling the 5 or 6 acres of cleavage Callie Lucent was displaying. Irene sniffed that any woman over 40 would dare wear a Betsy Johnson, especially in a high-end, upper-class place like Joel's. Positively reeking of good taste was just unthinkable. All she needed to complete the ensemble, Irene thought with uncharacteristic sarcasm, was a pair of castanets and a guitar player shouting "Olé." That made her smile, and she dabbed her glossy lips delicately with her napkin. Good thing she'd remembered to use her new Clinique Stay the Day lipstick, before once more putting her attention back on her crab cake. Swirling a forkful in the mild golden curry sauce, she took a bite. It really was scrumptious. But if she ate the whole thing...
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
And the pâte de chocolat served with crème fraîche sorbet and a rolled sugar wafer cookie she'd been eyeing on the menu, or maybe the delicious-sounding crème caramel with honey vanilla ice cream, and a sweet almond wafer cookie. They both sounded so good. And a couple more glasses of this positively yummy 1999 Marsanne Rosé from Domaine B. Claire in Burgundy, France. She'd either have to skip dinner tonight, or march right into the washroom and throw it up. Suddenly, just like he was right there across the table from her, his laugh lines deep as the Grand Canyon and his merry eyes twinkling like stars, Irene could hear her dearly departed and oh so deeply missed dead lover Henry Archer's gruff down-home rumble.
If y'all are gonna just upchuck it the second y'all finish eating it really mean, what's the goddamn point of spending this kind of cash on lunch?
Her china blue eyes welled with tears. Oh, Daddy Hank, she thought. He wasn't really like her real daddy, but since he'd been so much older than she was and took care of her better than her real daddy ever did, never hitting her, except when they played spanky pants, and never forcing her to do anything she didn't honestly truly want to, except when they played Rape Me Till I Squeal? Or maybe sometimes when they played Good Till the Last Drop, which really wasn't her favorite game, to tell the honest truth. And never ever calling her horrible, cruel names like Daddy's Little Blow-Up Dolly?
How could you leave me like that, my sweet Daddy Hank, without even saying goodbye to your darling Reedy Bean?
It had been 6 months, but not a day went by that she didn't miss her darling daddy. It was, in fact, why she was sitting here in Swanky Joel's restaurant. Today was their first anniversary. Well, it would have been their first anniversary, that is, if Henry Archer hadn't been so tragically killed in that tragic car accident out on the Parkway. Could it really be 6 months since he'd been killed so tragically? It seemed like only yesterday they were snuggling on his big round king-size bed, or kissing in his kidney-shaped pool, or just holding hands like a pair of giddy freshmen away at college. That was, Daddy Hank had still been married to that positively vulpine Callie Archer then. Vulpine was Irene's new word of the day. One of the many self-improvement things Irene was doing to improve herself, so she could rise up above the red dirt poor country-style life she'd grown up in. But she obviously wasn't satisfying him, not like a real woman could. Not like I could, thought Irene, tossing her glorious mane of flaxen hair in vexation. There was no one in the world she hated more than Callie Archer, who used to be married to Daddy Hank before he met Irene and found out what true love really was. What is love? Daddy Hank had promised to leave his wife for Irene. He'd even started the divorce proceedings, but then he died so tragically in that tragic car accident before he could even change his will, before he could divorce Callie, before he could marry his beloved Reenie Bean and make an honest woman out of her. And then, to add insults to injury, to make matters worse, as if they could ever get any worse, the straw that broke the camel's back was when Callie turned around and married Bruce Lucent just a week after poor Daddy Hank died. Callie inherited everything and Irene was left practically penniless. Callie even cancelled the lease on that cute little Lexus coupe Daddy Hank had given Irene, the merciless, heartless, cruel witch! It was enough to make Daddy Hank turn over in his grave. If he had a grave, there was, but he didn't, being cremated after all, since Callie was too cheap to buy a plot and casket and cement liner. She'd had him stuffed into the cheapest cardboard box the funeral home had, and then mailed the box to Irene, postage due. The arrogant woman. If only there was a way I could make her pay, Irene thought, fiercely fighting back the tears that welled to her lovely china blue eyes. If only there was something I could take away from her. Bruce Lucent was finishing his part of the presentation, nodding and smiling at the applause. As his technical assistant took over explaining the technical parts of the software, Bruce put his hand on Callie's shoulder and murmured, "Back in a second, hon!" Then he headed out to the 42-seat private chef's room, which was just off the kitchen. It had beautiful art, high ceilings, and state-of-the-art technology available to rent, which is probably why Bruce Lucent chose it for his software presentation. And suddenly, like she'd been struck by lightning, a light bulb went off over Irene's pretty head. Once more patting her glossy lips and tucking her Clinique Stay-the-Day lipstick in the pocket of the chic little Versace number she'd carefully picked out that morning, knowing it accentuated her voluptuous, perfect size 6 body, Irene slid out of her chair and leaned close to Rory to confide, "Just going to powder my nose, Roar. Order me the pot de chocolat served with creme fraiche sorbet and a rolled sugar wafer cookie, will you?" She had a feeling she'd be hungry when she got back. Stephen Suffern eyed the voluptuous young blonde as she left the room, her round ass looking like a juicy Georgia peach in that sexy little number she was wearing. Stephen, a masseuse at Atlanta's Polo Club, had an eye for the ladies, but he liked to bat for both teams. In fact, he had his eye on the studly older guy she'd been sitting with. Stephen had asked around and found out quite a bit about Rory Edwards, who was 60 but didn't look a day over 40. One was that the hard body was just as good without the clothes, no corset for Mr. Edwards. And the other was that Rory Edwards was loaded, rich, rolling in the dough, and unattached. The unattached part was the one Stephen was hoping to personally change, and hopefully by this afternoon, supper time maybe, or this evening at the latest. He'd scored a ticket to the $200 a plate luncheon presentation by giving an extra special massage to fat old Mrs. Decatur. He'd never be able to watch the movie Deliverance again without thinking fondly on the moment. He'd known there would be dozens of fat, rich pigeons at a do like this. No reason he couldn't pluck one. And Rory Edwards was the perfect pigeon. Stephen had seen the way his eyes, a lovely chocolate brown behind his spectacles, had kept roving his way. He might have a chubby for the luscious blonde, but put a bat in his hands, and he'd nail one out of the park. Stephen rose, unconsciously checking his handsome visage in the mirror for added flecks of microbasil. He'd had the crab cakes, and made his way over to Rory Edwards.
Mind if I sit down and chat for a moment?
He asked, his pleasant baritone warm and inviting. He put out his hand and offered a manly squeeze, which Rory Edwards returned with equal fervour.
"Oh, my companion will return shortly,"
Edwards stammered. Stephen slid his hand under the table, expertly flicking the snowy linen tablecloth over Edward's lap to cover the fact that his nimble fingers were even now sliding down the zipper of Edward's expensive Ralph Lauren stain-repellent slacks.
Don't sweat it, handsome,
he murmured with a throaty growl that made perspiration beads pop out on Edward's surprised face.
This won't take long.
Irene smoothed the skirt of her natty little Versace number over her curvy hips, smiling a secret smile to herself as she re-entered the 42-seat private dining room. She was a little out of breath, and if truths are told, her stay-the-day lipstick hadn't quite held up to its advertised promise of lasting through everything. But otherwise, no one would guess that she'd just moments before been riding Bruce Lucent like a champion bucking bronc rider at a Texas rodeo, his face buried between her firm, high breasts that bounce, unfettered and free. There was a young man sitting in Irene's seat, but he jumped to his feet the moment he saw Irene, giving her a smile that showed off his perfect white teeth. He had the most startlingly green eyes, like a cat's, an emerald colour that showed off his golden tan and sculpted features. Irene's own china blue eyes strayed down to his crotch, noting with expert quickness that he dressed left and was hung like a stallion. She licked her lips, smiling as she lifted her hungry eyes off his crotch. Surely she'd worked off enough calories with Bruce that she could have her 2 desserts after all.
"You'd never guess what I've been doing, Roar,"
Irene confided, sure the young man couldn't hear her, not realizing that he could indeed and was hanging on every word.
"I've just given Bruce Lucent the ride of his life."
Irene laughed merrily, her laugh like a dozen little tinkling bells, and tossed her magnificent mane of flaxen hair.
"I followed him into the men's room," she said in a purring voice. "Caught he with his pants down, so to speak."
Rory Edwards just blinked at her, his mouth open a little. Irene laughed again, gaily, enjoying the effect she was having. This would certainly get him in the mood for what she had planned later this afternoon. Irene stopped, suddenly aware that Rory Edwards' eyes had stopped blinking. His hand, clutching his handkerchief, had fallen to his lap, pushing aside the tablecloth that had, until that fateful moment, been covering the fact that his fly was down, and his rather large and still a tumescent member was fully exposed, and his Ralph Lauren stain-free slacks hadn't lived up to their reputation. Rory Edwards, in fact, had stopped altogether. His heart, at least, strained to its very limits. From Stephen Suffolk's expert ministrations, it had been pushed beyond the very limits of human endurance by listening to Irene's spirited and passionate exposition of her washroom conquest of software developer Bruce Lucent. Irene's lovely china blue eyes seized with horror and flew to Stephen Suffolk, who was standing stock still and frozen with utter shock behind them. Then she began to scream, loud and long, even louder than she'd shrieked while being
pleasured
by Bruce Lucent. But this time, no one moved to put his hand over her glossy lips and stop her anguished cries. Like an ululating siren, klaxoning on and on and on and on and on and on and on. She kept it up for a full 23 piercing minutes until the police arrived and a craggy officer finally slapped her to shut her the hell up.
Shut your mouth, pussycat, e farmi un macchiato. Pronto.
Georgia on my mind.
Hey, don't hit women. And do support me on Patreon like all of these cool people, especially Break System, BSC, and Michael Maris. This was a very long, tumescent chapter that went on and on and on and on and on. But I had fun. I hope you did.